viewers, welcome back to the Preaching Humanist with David Oliverio, that is I, where no God is required for a life of love, joy, peace, fulfillment, meaning, and purpose in life. And the good life is one guided by reason and motivated by love. You'll notice I have a gentleman here with me. This is Chris Robison.
Robison, no, I'm in the middle.
All right. He told me that before and I already forgot it. I even have a cup of coffee in me today, so I'm flying high. A legal drug, by the way. And we are going to discuss the scientific method, how it's used, why we need to use it to determine truth from falsity. So I, as a former fundamentalist, charismatic evangelist and preacher years ago, have someone here who's going to explain it to you, hopefully, my dear Christian friends, why we need to use it, what it's all about, and we will discuss these things. So before I begin to ask you some questions, I'm going to turn it over to Chris, and I'm going to explain what he does, and he's going to go into much greater detail. For many years now, since I've been very overt in my humanism and atheism to my religious friends out there, trying to help persuade you that you don't need this in your life to have a wonderful life and a good life. Many Christians have given me comments over and over again on how they have great disdain and they belittle the scientific method, or even scientists, that they're these arrogant, proud, atheistic people. Well, I have one with me right here, a real-life scientist. He's a down-to-earth guy. I even touch him there. Look at that. He's a real person. And he's actually a really nice guy, down-to-earth guy. So we're going to discuss these things today. So Chris's occupation is a behavioral neuroscientist.
That's right.
From UT Austin, right here in the great city of Austin, Texas. So I'm going to ask Chris, I'm going to turn it over to him, and he's going to explain to you, my viewers, the importance of science and how we really need it in our lives if we want to progress as a species, right? So, Chris, I would like you to tell my viewers your background, your upbringing, what type of background, because my viewers know my background, hardcore fundamentalist Christianity, no science, just straight Bible. So we come from a different background in some way. So Chris, go ahead and tell us.
Yeah, so my background is, well, I come from a non-religious family, but not a strictly atheistic family either. So I wasn't brought up saying, learning that I was not to believe in God, nor was I brought up saying I should believe in that, but rather I was taught about different religious traditions, about Christianity and Judaism and to some extent, non-Western religions like Buddhism and Hinduism, but not quite as much. But what I recall most strongly about my religious upbringing was when I went to a Bible school, a vacation Bible school in the summer, and learning about Noah's Ark and about the stories of Jesus from the New Testament, and thinking that those sounded an awful lot like the Greek and Roman myths that I was also learning about at home, and thinking this is neat, this is fun, but this isn't something that I considered even at that young age as taking as historical truth. And I feel that way. I felt that way then. I feel that way now, actually, where these things are basically mythological traditions, just like the ancient Egyptian religions or the religions of any other group that you would consider as being false if you don't think those gods exist. So if you just take them as stories which had some sort of cultural value, that had some sort of value for like group cohesion or passing traditions along, but you have to realize that in ancient times, in ancient history, they didn't have a historical tradition. They didn't think it was important to literally transfer the truth, but rather like the spirit of that truth. And so that's what I view them as now, and that view stems directly from how I was brought up, seeing these things as stories rather than truths.
Right. Did your parents raise you to use what I call the all-important antidote for religion or supernatural beliefs, which is called critical thinking, and I've discussed that before on some of my previous episodes. But were you raised to use that clear, rational type thinking informed by evidence? Were you taught by your parents to use critical thinking, or is this something that you developed on your own?
I think it's a little bit of both. I was sort of influenced by my grandfather was a microbiologist. Wow. And so when I went to their house when I was a little kid, then you could break out the microscope and we'd take like little drops of, wow. of like pond scum and things like that and see these little creatures zipping around underneath the microscope. And I thought that was really cool, and learned about how to go about doing basic field work and things like that. But there wasn't a whole lot of emphasis on critical thinking. I think that was just sort of an implicit sort of thing. And I didn't really get far into that until I guess I got to college, and I really got serious about science. And then I really started thinking about critical thinking, and I was taking a lot of classes in like math and logic at the time too, and they sort of melded together in a very nice way.
Wow. Yeah, anytime, for you viewers out there, anytime that I have dialogue with a fellow atheist and humanist like Chris, I'm just fascinated how the backgrounds are so different. It's like a dichotomy, right? So different. And how I feel like I have missed so much of this rational lifestyle as a younger man years ago when I was involved in Christianity. And how once I let go of Christianity 20 to 25 years ago and tried to begin this life of reading and education, learning the natural world from people like Chris, people that do peer reviews and the scientific method, reading their information, hanging out with them, going to lunch and affiliating with them, associating with them, having dialogue with them, I tend to learn more and more. And I think that all of us can learn from those, which I always talk about, the division of labor. Those of us that have specialties, we learn from each other. We don't, as atheists, turn to a God for the knowledge and wisdom, which the Bible tells you to do, but we turn to each other, the enlightened human minds, which I've discussed before. So, Chris, I want to discuss with my viewers let's discuss the scientific method, how important the scientific method is, and the basics of how it works. Maybe I'm asking a lot of questions here, but just kind of go into how it began, why it's so important, and just the basics of the tool of science and how we that believe in the scientific method use it to determine what is true and false, and maybe even how the scientific method has never once found anything other than the natural world, anything supernatural. So just expound on some of these on the scientific method.
So yeah, the scientific method has been with us for a while. There was something akin to the scientific method in the ancient world, especially in say Greece and Rome, where they had this kind of skeptical tradition, but it wasn't really formalized until the Renaissance, where guys like Francis Bacon, the Baconian scientific method, which is what most of us learn in school, was developed. That's the thing where you have a hypothesis and you have methods and you run an experiment and you write up a discussion and you reach conclusions, and it's that sort of thing. But really, what we're trying to do when we have a scientific method is to address this question of what is true and what is not in an empirical way. So by which I mean there's some sort of phenomenon that we can observe that's maybe repeatable, hopefully. And so we have to come up with some sort of idea for why we think it's happening, whatever we're observing. So let's say I'm doing behavioral neuroscience. I'm observing these animals and they're engaging in some sort of behavior. Let's say I'm looking at rats and they're scratching themselves in a funny way. And I think, well, maybe it's this brain area that's doing that. Maybe this other brain area is doing it. Maybe the rats are doing it when they're stressed out, when they're anxious. And I can come up with different ways to test that. So let's say I think that these rats scratch themselves whenever they're anxious. So that's my hypothesis. And then I have to come up with some way of testing that. And so maybe I could test that by activating a brain area associated with anxiety, or injecting them with some kind of hormone associated with stress, or by looking at rats that engage in that behavior and seeing if the areas involved in anxiety are more active, things like that. And so I have a variety of different experimental ideas that I can come up with. And ideally, I want to do multiple ones of those, because science isn't about coming up with a pet theory and proving that pet theory, but rather coming up with what is the most probable explanation for what you're observing.
Right.
And so I'd want to come up with maybe 2 or 3 different experiments, and if all the evidence pointed in the same direction for all of those, then that means I've got a pretty good idea of what's happening. And if they're not, then maybe I have to go back to the drawing board and come up with a new hypothesis.
Okay, I'm going to cut in, excuse me, but this is what I run into quite often with you, my dear Christian friends, and even other religious-minded people that really look down upon the scientific method and scientists. Well, they say, a lot of Christians will tell me, well, science is wrong a lot, or they're biased and so forth. And I try to explain to them in my novice way that it's more objective thinking, right? They go into it, supposedly, maybe not all scientists, but you're supposed to go into it, correct me if I'm wrong, open-minded, looking for reality and truth, right?
Sure, and everybody's going to be biased in some way, but the whole idea of the scientific method is that you design it in such a way that you overcome your bias, or you avoid it insofar as possible. For instance, peer review. It's a way where if I'm so biased that my experiment is badly designed, then I can have other scientists come in and go through it with a fine-tooth comb and say, that's not fit for publication because you've designed a bad experiment that doesn't show what you think it shows. And if I can show somebody's substantially wrong and show that I am right, then that's a surefire way to success and fame in the scientific community. We ache to prove each other wrong. That's like a big deal.
Yeah, I've heard that quite often. So there's something else I really want to discuss is there's a quote I learned many, many years ago that about the looking for overwhelming evidence on how science works. Absolute proof in science is nearly unattainable. Instead, a theory is proposed and debated until the weight of the evidence is so overwhelming that everyone commonly accepts that that theory or hypothesis is true. Is that true? I mean, is that how it works? You look for peer review, overwhelming evidence. Now, and is it absolute? Because I know Christians will go, aha, it's not absolute, because I know scientists who are Christians that say that religion and science are compatible and so forth. So can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, my view is that it's not absolute, or almost never absolute, because what we're doing is we're not somehow like understanding some great celestial metaphysical truth. We're understanding observations that we're making somewhere in a laboratory, or maybe pointing a telescope up at the sky and observing galaxies or something. And so what we do is we try to come up with some sort of statistical model for what's happening, and you can use your modeling to come up with basically differing probabilities. And so let's say I give a rat a drug and I observe that it's got one set of behavior, and I give another set of rats no drug and they have a different set of behaviors. I can count those behaviors, I can quantify those behaviors in different ways, like how many do they have, how often do they do them, for how long, and then I can do just a statistical analysis to see if those groups are actually different from each other. And so I might apply a statistical model and say there is a 1 in 10,000 chance that this difference is just pure coincidence, and there is a 9,999 in 1 to 9,999 chance that there's actually a difference between them. And so it could be that 1 in 10,000. It could be. And in order to show that it's not, I have to do, say, another experiment if I want to be even more precise and accurate. But for the most part, that's not really necessary if it's bolstered by other findings, or if it's consistent with other findings. And the only time that you'd want to have more precision than that, or you would need to have more precision than that, is if you're doing something that's like so absolutely important that you get it right, that you can put like more money and resources into it. Otherwise, it's just not efficient.
Good. Very good stuff. You know, since I have a real neuroscientist right here, I'm going to pick his brain a little bit, and you guys can learn too and listen. So Chris, this is something I've always wanted to ask a brain scientist. I have you right here with me. Why is it that some of us, let's talk genetics here, we're born progeny, say you have, parents have 2 or 3 children. They have the same genetic gene from the 23 chromosomes, right, from each parent and so forth. Why is it that some very strong Christian families have an individual called the black sheep of the family. They're able to figure this out. They're able to see that, this religion that I was raised in to believe, all the truths that we call the Bible or God's ways, it came to a point in our life, or my life, that it didn't make sense anymore. I know a lot of fellow freethinkers that came from my background that their siblings really are still in the unenlightened phase, in the Jesus bubble. They just don't get it. Why do some people come out of it? Why do some people see the light of reason and rationality? Is this something that maybe you've done some tests in? Is it something that's genetic? Some people have a mind more geared toward the scientific method, or not?
Well, I would be lying if I said that I had like a good definitive answer to that. I'm not sure anybody does. What I can say is that each person's brain is unique because our brains and everything that we think and everything that we feel, which is born out of the biology of those brains, is highly contingent. It's contingent on genetics, and unless you're an identical twin, nobody on the planet has the same exact genetics as you. It's contingent upon your development. Even if you are an identical twin, you haven't been exposed to all the same experiences, all the same phenomena, and it's a result of, say, even the experiences of your parents are known to have these epigenetic effects, which can have lasting behavioral consequences on you. And really, I think that it's just some sort of fortunate confluence of genetics and environment and personal experiences that is going to cause these massive psychological differences between people who are otherwise very biologically similar, because none of us are the same because of those things.
Good. Where do you think science is heading in the United States of America right now? I know there's this big divide of those that belittle science and your profession, and those that do value science. So where do you think that we're going as a country, as far as science education, as far as youngsters and the next generation? Are we moving more that way? Are we catching Western Europe and Canada as far as rationality and less religion and more science, or not?
We might be catching up with them in terms of more rationality, just from a purely societal standpoint. What worries me more is where we're heading in terms of scientific funding, because there have been some recent increases in, say, the NIH budget and the NASA budget, but those are actually fairly minor, and they really don't account for changes in, say, inflation rates. So we're well below right now the level of funding through the National Institutes of Health, which is where most neuroscientists get their funding, much lower than we were in, say, the year 2000. The funding is just objectively lower after accounting for inflation. And that's problematic because there are other countries that aren't falling behind in funding. So places like you said in Western Europe, for instance, and the more affluent East Asian countries, they all have excellent research programs as well. And so if we want America to remain at the forefront in the sciences, then we've got to make sure that our scientists are funded, basically. And if they're not, well, then as science goes, the economy will also go. I think that's just inevitable.
Wow. I want to touch on one more thing, and this is what I really want to spend a little more time on before we close. I get pejorative statements from Christians often, especially the further to the right, about scientists, about the whole scientific method. A lot of it comes from social conservatives, maybe the right-wingers. I'm more of a progressive liberal type guy. And it seems like they just almost have this hatred. I mean, when I bring up so-and-so's a scientist, or I like to use meteorology and weather science. I've even got it, I think I've showed you before. I like to keep on my iPhone the actual temperature of different cities, and maybe the cities where my children or grandchildren live, my family members, my parents. And I like to keep up with data, because a rational person's foremost concern are with facts and with what is true. We like data, we like facts, and that's pretty much science. And one of my close friends years ago told me, "Oh, David, you're so skeptical. Why do you have to be so skeptical? Why don't you just believe?" You know, that type of thing. So even on my iPhone, I keep data. So, you know, I'm sure it drives people crazy, but somebody will say, and many of them are religious people or very conservative, "Well, wonder what the weather's going to be like tomorrow. I feel like it's going to be cold." And I usually do, well, let me see what the science says. I mean, it's not always 100% right, but they're usually right. And I'll read updated forecasts from the scientists, weather scientists, on the weather in this particular city. Now, one individual, an older man who doesn't believe in science, a very strong Christian, literally told me, "No, I know the forecast for my city. I saw it 24 hours ago." And I tried to explain to this person that weather changes. It's not that the science changes so much. The scientists are not changing their mind. They're telling you what the weather's doing. It is what it is.
As they get more information about the weather, they feed it into their model, and they can get more accurate, more up-to-date information.
Yeah. It's just such a belittling and disdain for it. So what would you say if someone told you, "Well, I don't really believe in science. You guys are wrong all the time. I think you guys are arrogant. I think you're wrong." I mean, how would you talk to someone like this?
Well, scientists are certainly wrong sometimes, and that's the whole point of the scientific method, is to correct yourself when you're wrong, and to try to get a better and better model of how to predict whatever it is that you're trying to look at, whether it's the weather or an animal's behavior, or say the weather maybe it could be the weather on a different planet, or it could be some kind of chemical reaction that you're interested in looking at the speed of, or the dynamics of, or something like that. And the entire point of science is to come up with models that explain the world that we live in, and then use that model to predict future outcomes. That's really the whole point of it. It's to look at those things. And I think that people who really doubt that scientific method, or who doubt a specific area of science, say somebody who says, I don't trust those, let's say, vaccines. I don't think vaccines work. That's a big thing. That's actually common among actually a lot of people on the left don't like vaccines. So it's not just conservatives. Right. There are conservatives and there are liberals, and people who don't trust scientific findings, I think, are usually guilty of what's called post hoc rationalization, where you've already made up your mind, and then you track your way backwards to figure out why you should object to things that you don't agree with. And really, if you want to have the best available model of how things work, you have to have your mind open. You have to be open to changing them.
That's what I want to discuss. Let's do one more thing. I'm going to try to keep this short and we'll stop, is changing minds. I've had even some of my clients in my business and personal training will try to, they're upset that I changed my mind. So for example, I think I've gone over this in one of my episodes before. I was a big time vegan for a long time. And I got, what I like to say is we all are subject to the intellectual black hole, hate to say it, but of pseudoscience. Sometimes we all get off track. That's why we need each other. You have to look for the correct data and evidence. So when some of us that are objective thinkers change our minds, like I did on veganism, on my water consumption, I've talked about that. I was using all the pseudoscience about how much water I should take, and I was freaking peeing every 5 minutes. So I knew I was flushing my body out, but I was not wanting to look at contrary evidence. I didn't want to look at anything because it was more of a confirmation bias, right? I wanted to hold on to my beliefs. I didn't want to look at real data. So I think that those of us that are open for what is real and true, not just what makes us feel good, and I'm also talking to you magical religious people out there too, you've got to be open-minded and look, and sometimes you have to stand to be corrected, right? I mean, I've had to stand, and I've had clients tell me, well, you changed your mind. A few years ago, you told me I should be eating all plants and not meat. And then they say, well, see, the science is always wrong. No, not so much. It was, first of all, it could have changed with new information, right? And I didn't look for the correct data. I was looking for information that confirm my own preconceived notions.
Yeah.
So talk about how that kind of changes at times.
Yeah, well, I mean, you can even think about it I'm not a dietary expert by any means, but it's been decades since we've known that saturated fats, for instance, were bad. You don't want saturated fats. They're good at glomming up, and they can give you this arteriosclerosis. They can clog your blood vessels. And so for a while, a proposed healthy alternative to that were the so-called trans fats, these trans fatty acids. And those are absolutely bad. They're terrible for you, that to the extent that we're looking to eradicate them from the diet of any restaurant that you would go to. They're trans fatty acid free. And so maybe the cis acids, these cis unsaturated fats are okay, but the trans ones are not. And so at one point, I was like, yeah, try these ones. They might be better. They weren't. And how do we know? Because, well, new data came in saying that now that people are eating more of these, well, actually the incidence of heart disease has gone up as a result of that. And it seems to be correlated with how much of these fatty acids you have in your diet. And you can do that for anything, where you come up with an idea that is in line with the information that you have. And then as you gain more information, you might change the notion that you have. It doesn't mean that your previous information was bad. Saturated fats are absolutely bad for you. But you have this new information that now lets you make a more nuanced decision. That's all that it is.
Well, good. I'm going to have to end now. Boy, I hate to. We're having a lot of fun here, but I'm trying to keep these episodes short because I got a big mouth. I could go for hours. And when I used to preach, people would literally sit there for up to an hour and a half and listen to me. And now I lose people's attention after 5 or 10 minutes. It's quite fascinating. So I think that was maybe the drug part of the dopamine being released in the brain, the good feeling.
Dopamine and serotonin and oxytocin. There's all feel-good molecules.
I used to remember those days. But you know what? I have chosen reason and rationality and reality. So I want to thank you for watching the Preaching Humanist with David Oliverio. And I want to thank you, Chris, for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
I really appreciate picking your brain. I love to pick these intelligent scientists' brains every chance I can. And I think that if we ask each other questions and we remain open and objective in our thinking, we can progress. So my encouragement to those of you that are on the fringe, those of you that are still in that religious bubble, and you're beginning to see, oh, this doesn't sound right. There is an alternative. It's called critical thinking. It's called rationality and reason. It's called open up your mind and look for data and evidence and demand it. Ask questions. Be skeptical. As I and many others did when we finally figured this out, that there's nothing up there, no evidence for anything supernatural. And then we learn how to build our lives into humanism and making this world better every day without God belief. And Chris came from a totally different background than I have, totally opposite, but we're both human beings. We're trying to make this world better, and we don't really see any evidence for anything supernatural, any gods.
That is such.
Yes, and we're both very happy, and we have fulfillment, meaning in life. So thank you for watching, and come back and join me soon. We'll have another episode. And have a good day.